This is roughly 1,000 tree frog tadpoles, which are on their way to becoming an army of tree frogs. This is going to be a fun one, so grab your favorite snack, sit back, and enjoy the story of 1,000 tree frog tadpoles. It was hot, like really hot. So naturally, my dad wanted to set up his pool to cool off in. However, the local tree frogs saw the partially made pool as a perfect breeding ground. So while my dad was distracted, the tree frogs swooped into the pool and did, grown-up stuff. I helped my dad remove the frogs, but it was already too late. They had made hundreds and hundreds of little tree frog tadpoles. My dad wasn't too keen on getting them in his bathing suit, so he wanted them gone, in whatever way was most efficient. Stop! Don't slurp up those tadpoles. They're gonna be frogs one day. Yeah, but let me save you. So I got to scooping. Bucket load after bucket load, I saved the tree frog tadpoles, which of course meant I now had hundreds of tree frog tadpoles to deal with. At first, I just had them in this tub. They were only in there for a few days before I realized that some of them were dying. And that's because the ammonia levels got too high. So I quickly put them in this planted tub. The plants will soak up the ammonia and filter the water. And that worked very well. Since they were in that tub, I didn't lose a single one. But I can't see them very well in this tub, so I'm going to build them a paludarium. Someone was throwing this tank away, and I'm grateful that I was able to get it for free. Now, I like to do things as naturally and cheaply as I can. So instead of purchasing 40 pounds of sand, I collected and carried it from down by the river. I sloped the sand to one side so as the tadpoles develop into tree frogs, they can crawl out of the water and onto the land. Then it was time for the main piece of hardscape, which is this cedar root. Now, if cedar is too green, it can release unwanted toxins into the water. However, this piece is very old and shouldn't be a problem. Once that was in place, I needed gravel. I put down a healthy layer, and then it was time for some terrestrial plants. I'm using hostas because they do very well in flooded environments, and they were growing in the garden out back, so they were free. Then I needed some more hardscape, some rocks. Just kidding, these were actually pretty close by. With any good setup, it's about balancing the aesthetic with the practical, so I made sure the transition from water to land was a nice one. This backyard moss should also do well in this environment, as it wicks up the moisture from the sand below. For the other side, I added another hosta, which also had some ivy growing with it. I think this is one of my favorite scapes I've built so far, and it cost me $0. But it's a little bit dry, so let's add the water. I had to do this in a couple rounds because the first time you fill a new setup, there's always a lot of dirt in the water. But after siphoning it out and filling it again, it was looking pretty clear, which of course means it's now time to add the tadpoles. Net load after net load, I began putting the tree frog tadpoles into their new nursery. I found it difficult to capture on camera the sheer quantity of these tadpoles. I can only get a small portion of them in any given shot. That's because they spread across the paludarium quite a bit, hiding in every nook and cranny. If I were to estimate how many there are at this point, it would be well into the hundreds. And that's just the beginning, but we'll get to that later. Perhaps it's just my imagination, but I couldn't help but see them wriggling around with a sense of enthusiasm, exploring this new and vibrant world with excitement and curiosity. Realistically, they were probably just looking for food. Food which I would have to provide. In the early stage of their life, tadpoles are vegetarians. They can eat algae and other aquatic plants, so that's what I gave them. I also put in a few botanicals, which I'm sure had some tasty things on them. And for good measure, I threw in some snails. Not for the tadpoles to eat, but to help clean up after them. I also added another plant to help with water filtration. Then it was just a matter of waiting. At least, that's what I thought. This is where our story gets interesting. There were hundreds of more tadpoles in need of rescue. They had hatched into this plant bin, which was about to be dumped due to a mosquito infestation. So I rescued even more tree frog tadpoles and mosquitoes alike. In they went, hundreds of tadpoles and hundreds of mosquito larvae. Then, wouldn't you know it, as my dad continued to clean the pool, I saw that I had missed some tadpoles. And not just a few, but an entire bucket load. These tadpoles varied a lot in size. Some were the biggest I'd seen so far, and some were just as small as the first batch. That means another 100 or so tadpoles were added to the Paludarium. At this point, my estimate is about 1,000. Hopefully the size variation won't be an issue, like the big ones won't start eating the little ones. That might not make for a very wholesome video. The Paludarium was certainly at its max capacity, but it was doing very well. The plants were doing a good job filtering the water, and they were growing quickly. One of the hostas was even about to bloom. Unfortunately, this wouldn't last long. It was at this time when our story takes a turn for the worse. Weeks later, the flowers had wilted, the plants were dying, and the mosquitoes were a terror. I exterminated as many of the shrill bloodsuckers as I could, but they were the least of my worries. The water had turned brown, and the glass was covered with dead algae. Alright, so that's a little bit overdramatic. Really, I just need to clean the tank. It's not something I personally enjoy, but I do enjoy looking at the tadpoles, which I can't do very well if my tank is a mess. So after cleaning the glass, I got to work on clearing up the water. To tackle that, I'll use a hose, a sponge, and a rubber band. Together, they make the perfect filtered siphon, which will allow me to suck out the dirty water without giving any of the tadpoles an extreme water sports experience. I cleared up the water's surface, sprayed off the leaves, and replaced the old water with some new fresh water. With the Paludarium looking crystal clear, I could finally enjoy viewing the tadpoles once again. And I noticed they had grown quite a bit. But at this point, if these tadpoles were going to grow any faster, they were going to need protein, fish food. Every day I would sprinkle in a healthy amount of fish food flakes. At first, the tadpoles weren't sure what it was and didn't really eat it. But once one curious tadpole got his first taste, the entire Paludarium of tadpoles erupted in a cacophony of ferocious munching. I fed them twice a day, every day for a couple weeks, and boy did those tads get chunky. Then, come the next cleaning time, this happened. I can't believe this just happened. So, I was just cleaning the tadpole tank, scraping the glass, and then all of a sudden something moved. I was like, what was that? And then I looked down, and there was the most adorable tree frog I'd seen in my entire life. Somehow, this little guy had evaded my attention for at least a few days after crawling on land. Which shouldn't really be that surprising, considering he's about half the size of my thumbnail. I have to say though, I wasn't expecting him now, considering none of the other tadpoles even have their hind legs yet. Although they are much, much bigger than they were when I got them. I think this little guy must have been this tadpole, which came from the second pool rescue. He was a lot larger than the other tadpoles at the time. Well, he can't eat fish food now, so I'll have to get him some bugs. I started out with a round of isopods, which he was pretty eager to eat. He even jumped on my finger to get one, which I thought was adorable. I threw the extra isopods in the stump so the tree frog could hunt them passively. But after a while of eating isopods, it seemed he was getting a little bit picky. Like a toddler, he kept spitting out the food he didn't like, and he just sort of sat there and gave me a look. So I figured it was time to bring in the crickets. He didn't seem to like the tweezers very much, but he certainly enjoyed the cricket. Over the next few days, I kept giving him crickets. I watched the little tree frog grow bigger and stronger with each meal and each day. By the way, if you're curious as to what kind of tree frogs these are, they are the common gray tree frog, which can be found across America's eastern coast. They're able to change color anywhere between black, gray, and this nice green color you see here. As for this little guy's brothers and sisters, well, they were finally starting to grow their legs. Their cartilage hardens into bone, and they develop lungs. After a while, their faces began to look less fish-like and more frog-like. They develop their front legs, and their mouths widen. It's at this point where their fish-like gills stop working. They need to go from breathing water to breathing air. After that, they float around the surface of the water, until eventually they grab onto something. Leaving their aquatic life behind, they crawl onto the land, no longer a tadpole, but now entering a new stage of life, froghood. This is a dramatic process of change, and it's not always easy. They have to be able to push through those holding them back, and be willing to lay aside their old way of life and embrace a new one. But in the wild, only 0.8% of tadpoles survive. The ones that don't cut it become food for the others. And only 0.1% of froglets develop into adult frogs. While the rates of survival have been better in this closed environment, it hasn't been without its casualties. I definitely have less tadpoles than I started with. And unfortunately, I lost 2 froglets. One night, I stumbled across a tadpole/froglet that was about to join the casualties. He needed air, but had sunk to the bottom of the tank, so I just gave him a little helping hand. It was all he needed to get a good breath of air and crawl on land. That was just one of many tadpoles to make it to froghood in this tank. Day after day, one tadpole after another ascended from the depths of the water and claimed their place among the terrestrial air-breathing creatures of the land. Now, what do these squishy little tree frogs do after they've crawled onto land? Well, basically nothing. See, they need to let their tails fully absorb into their body, so none of that energy-rich fat is wasted. Because of this, for the first few days, they don't need to eat. But once those days are up, they're going to need some food. Namely, bugs. Lots and lots of bugs. So I ventured into the woods, hoping to find a colony of termites. I figured termites would be plentiful, protein-rich, and pretty easy for the tree frogs to hunt. Unfortunately, after overturning every log in the woods, I came up empty-handed. But I did have an idea. I'd leave the Paludarium light on for a while into the evening. This would attract lots of small moths and other insects. Then I'd open the hatch and let the feeding frenzy begin. Some tree frogs were better at catching food than others. This one, which is the first to have developed, eats right out of my hand. I really like this tree frog because of that, and I think I'd like to call him Harold. Although he too is not all that bright. I guess that moth will live to die another day. At the moment, there are 10 tree frogs in the Paludarium. If you're counting along at home, you might notice that I only show 9 here, but that's just because I missed one on video, because these little guys can be hard to find. Now, while 10 is very far from 1,000, I think this Paludarium has reached its max frog capacity, which means it's time to unleash them unto the world. It was kind of bittersweet letting them go. After spending so much time with them and seeing them transform from these little black dots with tails, I had formed a little bit of a sentimental attachment. But I knew I couldn't keep them all and they'd be better off in the wild. Now, with that said, I was really hoping to keep Harold, the first tree frog. But unfortunately, a couple days later, he escaped through this tiny hole. So today that means I'm going to release 7, plus Harold, who released himself. I gathered them all in this jar, took the little squishies down to the woods.
Big spider.
Alright, where were we? I chose a remote area with a gently flowing spring and plenty of trees for the tree frogs to climb. The tree frogs seemed to be pretty eager to check out their new environment, except for this guy, who wanted to hitch a ride back on my shoe. At first, I was a bit worried for the little guys, but they didn't hesitate to make themselves right at home in their natural habitat. This one even already found something to eat. Witnessing that gave me confidence that even in this big and dangerous world, these tiny adventurers would be alright. And as for my dad, well, he eventually got to enjoy his pool. At least for a little while.
Hey, what are you doing? Hey, what?